Great.
Cool. Well, let's get started. Sam, we are super excited to host you as a speaker. As a quick intro, Sam is, of course, the co-founder and CTO of Patreon, which is one of the largest creator economy startups right now, valued at $4 billion, and also a serial entrepreneur. So Sam's first job out of Stanford back in 2006 was as a founding engineer at Loop, which was the social mapping startup that was co-founded by Sam Altman. And after around 3 years there, Sam founded his own mobile ad company called AdWorld, which got acquired within a year of founding it, actually, by AdMob, and then soon after got acquired by Google. And for 3 years after that, Sam sat at the Dog Hatch Labs incubator and just ideated on different startup ideas, very similar to what a lot of folks at SPC are doing right now. And sat next to cool people like Kevin Systrom and the founders of Instagram. And in 2013, you thought you were just starting to land on a startup idea that was kind of promising, but your old college roommate, Jack, hit you up. And Jack at the time was a full-time musician with a few 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So Jack asked Sam to help him build a way for him to directly collect donations from his YouTube fans. And Sam was super excited, especially since Sam was a former concert pianist himself. And Jack ended up raising a ton of money from his fans, and that sort of project turned into what Patreon is today. So there's a ton to dig into today there, but let's maybe start off with a few questions about your own personal journey as
You
an
ran through my
entrepreneur.
whole startup career and thoughts, so I'm done here. There's not much more I need to offer, but sure, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe also for the audience members, Zoom has a cool raise hand feature, so feel free to jump in at any time by just raising your hand. But yeah, first off, Sam, maybe could you just tell us a bit about where you grew up, your sort of formative teenage and college years, and your general journey toward deciding to become an engineer and entrepreneur?
Sure, yeah. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, over on the East Coast. So it's pretty quiet over there. I don't know, the most startup-y thing I did then was like program on my TI-82 and TI-86 calculators. If those might be too old for some of the folks here, but yeah, I took piano lessons as you called out at Carnegie Mellon while I was in high school, and then my parents were immigrants, so I also worked at the restaurant that they started. So I guess my dad had a sort of entrepreneurial spirit, but yeah, they had come over from Hong Kong, settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then actually I was born in Iowa, which is where they went to school, but then I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then worked at the restaurant, and eventually went out to California for college.
That's awesome. And what do you think sort of motivated you to go into engineering and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I mean, I I was always intrigued. I think this even was part of why Stanford was so appealing to me at the idea of just building out ideas. So like if you look at, especially there was a whole thought process I had in joining Loop, but around that time and afterwards, like a lot of what I did was just tinker around on either like emerging platforms or sort of new spaces. Examples of this were like when Facebook was releasing their platform, and you would see now, looking back, you have like multi-billion-dollar industries or companies created out of it, like Zynga. I like TripAdvisor, I sort of think it was largely built off that platform. But like at that time when it was out, me and my peers, we all saw that there were these little types of apps you could build. So I was building like quiz apps, and I remember like Julie Zoe and Mike Siegel. I don't know if people remember them, but they were classmates of mine too. They were building out like Fluff Friends, and so I built out like a virtual pet sort of thing, and actually saw like a lot of adoption there. So that got me really excited afterwards when like now we're looking at like 2006 or 7. First it was the iPhone, but then the App Store came out shortly after. So what you saw was a lot of people that were doing the same things with the Facebook platform started migrating over to the mobile platform too there. I think like the equivalent today, maybe something akin to like what's happening in decentralization and crypto. It seems like an emerging market where a lot of people are figuring out like what the lasting or what the long-term type of powerful apps will look like. At the beginning, for instance, at like iOS, it was a lot of really trivial things that started making a lot of money. And so this would include like the fart. I don't know if folks remember all this stuff. It was like the fart apps, the really trivial games. There was the silliest thing that was #1 on the App Store for weeks, called Mirror Free, and it was effectively just it turned your screen black. It was an app that you opened up and it was just black, so you could look at it as a mirror. And so I think similarly right now, you look at emerging markets, there are a lot of people figuring stuff out. Actually, if I were to elaborate a bit on this point, I think one of the things I learned through this whole process is like a lot of times I think with startups, people talk about like resilience, determination, and grit. And certainly I think that's a part that has to get you through areas, even with conviction. But I think another skill set or at least like belief that's equally as important is sort of knowing when to stop and to give up. Like I actually think there were a lot of different ideas that I worked on, where I was really excited and saw how it would be potentially very large, but ultimately like would hit either some cap or I would realize that, hey, a lot of my hypotheses or assumptions early on weren't sort of materializing. This was especially true actually in Dogpatch Labs. I was working on, at that time, it was really hot, the whole group buying space. And so you had your Groupon, your Living Social. I had built out this sort of white labeled solution that allowed any sort of vendor or business to build out their own group buying tipping sort of service. And I mean, it was doing okay from like a perspective of some money coming in. Like we were a small business, we were generating a few million overall, and then like maybe gross profits a few $100,000. And then we launched like fab.com, which I don't know if folks remember, it was like a furniture buying thing that Andreessen funded, that made over $1 billion and then totally collapsed. We saw that as like one of our largest businesses, and we thought there was real legs on this sort of white label group buying thing. But it didn't sort of go beyond that ever. And I think being able to realize to not continue working on it for like 2 or 3 more years afterwards, and start building out other things was what allowed me to eventually fall into Patreon too.
Interesting. Yeah. What sorts of signals were you getting from this sort of group buying project that made you feel like, okay, there's a limit on how big this can get?
Yeah. One framework I like that comes out of it was an interview that like Patrick Collison did in Y Combinator, was sort of like, how do you know you've really achieved sort of product market fit? Because you have sort of 2 mentalities prior and then afterwards. And the thinking there, because folks probably are familiar with this, but like Stripe took 2 years before they went publicly launching because they were iterating constantly, and working directly with a lot of different companies. Was initially you're sort of so in terms of your question around signals, initially I think you're trying to get the feedback, and you're very much like in this improve the product based on your understanding of how other people are using it, and figuring that out. But once they got to the place where effectively they had a group that really liked their product, and then what they found was like the next week that group would, and this is similar to actually to what we saw at Patreon, the next week there'd be a whole bunch of new users that you didn't go out and try to grab yourself, but it all came through word of mouth. And then you saw the subsequent week. And so instead of like thinking about the feedback primarily and like doing a lot of thought process around like what the psychology is behind why people want to use it, you're just then dealing with the scalability aspects of like, hey, like our payments are failing on this front, and hey, we haven't really built out the mechanism for people to invite each other, and so people are doing weird hacky things and we want to flesh that out. Like once you're filling in those gaps because you just can't keep up with sort of demand, at least that's a period that I think that feels like a strong inflection point to be like, okay, this feels like I'm on track with something. What's interesting is a lot of times through there you'll still hit plateaus afterwards, and then it's like a cycle, at least from my experience. You'll have to figure out then, like, okay, maybe you hit a particular market or surrounding area. And so at Patreon, this was certainly the case. I think we started off not on this monthly like subscription basis, but more around, hey, we believe the cycle for creativity is ebbing and flowing. So you could be, you know, have a lot of output for any given time and then maybe stop. And so we only wanted you to be charging your community when you released a new song or a new video or a new piece of content. But very quickly, you know, there was a lot of interest there. Very quickly, we saw that there was a greater need for people to just get more sustainable funding, and have it be consistent. And we did see a limit even to the first set of creators that we saw. So once we opened that up, we saw not just people who were creating music or whatnot, but like a lot of different creative use cases around like charities and organizations and physical gatherings. And so then we hit the initial plateau maybe with the idea behind per content, and then we moved on into this larger subscription based business that we built around afterwards.
Got it. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm curious actually. It seems like you spent, around 3 years iterating on different startup ideas. But the one that actually really took off, Patreon, it sounds like it was a almost like entirely serendipitous thing that happened to you, where your old college roommate approached you with a problem that he was facing himself, and it turned out to be like this huge thing. And I'm curious, maybe like what's your sort of reflection on that whole time?
Sure.
And do you have any advice for us? I think in terms of balancing our own exploration with being open to those sorts of serendipity.
Yeah, so I think there's a nuance here from what I said before too about knowing when to
Yeah,
give up. For sure, like I don't think you want to just power through everything blindly. Like there's the whether it's a skill set or whatever, like understanding discretion on when you feel like you should move to a different idea is important. But the nice thing about like the determination, resilience, or grit or whatever is that you're pushing through and you're developing things along the way. So totally serendipitous that like Jack was deep in this space and we were college roommates and we reconnected on this. But the nice thing when he came to me, actually at that time, I had literally the same day I met up with him at Coffee Bar in San Francisco. I had just launched another startup in like the photography space and had just launched the TechCrunch article. But the point being is I had built a lot of code and a lot of reusable foundation that allowed me to just move a lot faster subsequently. And so like even recently at Patreon, people like make fun of me because they find these remnants of companies like Apply and Chomp On, and it's just like in the code base, and they're like, what the heck are these things? It's because I was like leveraging whatever user authentication that I'd already fleshed out previously, and I wasn't going through all the motions again on a lot of that foundational work. And it allows you to get to like maybe the core pieces of what you think are important in testing out and trying in a business if you can quickly get to there. So I still feel like there is a lot of importance in not throwing away everything, right? And building on your learnings from there. Actually, I mentioned before, I have various slides that may be relevant here and there to
yeah,
stuff we're talking about. I can try to pull up. What's showing up now, actually? Is it the investor update? Is that what?
yeah. Investor update.
Maybe it will. Oh, sorry. So yeah, like when Jack came to me, like this is what he gave me, which was like these sketches with sort of a lot of like mad scientist ideas, I would say, around it. But like ultimately, we had to move into a place where, oh man, this is so fun too. We were like throwing together things at 99 Designs, and like any one of, actually this one's not too bad, any one of these could have been our logo. I'm glad it wasn't, but yeah, we it could have been any. That's not too bad either, actually. But we ultimately had to develop it into like a full-featured functioning website, and so I got to leverage a lot of frameworks that I had built previously, even from like the Facebook apps, right, which was like largely web-based. And that allowed us to launch effectively within like 1 to 2 months. And it actually, not, I wouldn't say this always matters, but timing, I think, is relevant. It was like a month or so afterwards, Hank Green, the Subbable, or he launched this company called Subbable, which was effectively doing what we were doing. And he had a much larger audience, the Green brothers, on YouTube. And so I think it could have been an entirely different world if we hadn't already launched and gotten some traction ahead of them. And so in that case, I think timing was relevant. But I'm gonna, this is a 2-minute video, so it's a bit long. Is it showing? I don't know if we can hear it, but I still think
Yeah, it's
like,
showing.
yeah, like grinding through. I'll show the 2-minute on this because Jack, I guess the point of this is I do think people create a myth around this notion of resilience. Even like the how I built this series, I think on entrepreneurship, it was like titled resilience. And I think like if you look at my co-founder, he's going to do the same. He's going to mythologize it. But I think it's yeah, well, I'll play through this and then I'll offer my comments on this. Can you hear? Is there audio? There's no audio.
I don't think
Okay,
so.
wait. There's a way to do this, right? How do I set the audio here?
And then you have to stop the screen sharing, and then when you re-enable screen sharing, there's an option at the bottom of the menu to share sound on
There
the
you go.
bottom
Beautiful.
left.
Yep. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me know if this is coming through.
There's a thing that creators do when you get obsessed with a thing and you just keep grinding on it and you work so hard and you don't sleep and you just kill yourself to turn a vision into a reality. And Sam is my co-founder. This video isn't supposed to be about him, but every time I think about that first year of Patreon, it becomes about Sam, because Sam would code in bed and he would like fall asleep for an hour and then he'd wake up and then he'd keep coding and then he'd fall asleep and he'd wake up and he'd keep coding. He was the only engineer and we were servicing, you know, thousands and thousands of accounts, and only Sam. And his room was just disgusting because he was around the clock working so hard. Look at this fucking mess on his desk. It's unbelievable. I mean, he hates when I show these photos, but I just have to, because these photos are the embodiment of what it means to take a thing in your head and to make it real and put it in the world. It's creation. It's the making of a thing. It's the turning of something into a reality. I'm so grateful to Sam. He has a work ethic unlike anyone else I know. This is my favorite photo of Sam. This is how I remember Sam the first. Honestly, I get emotional looking at this photo and thinking about this. He gave himself fully to Patreon, to our mission, to what we're doing. And okay, so before I totally turn on the waterworks on camera.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things. First, Jack is I think really exciting speaker, so I'm sorry that you guys don't have him today and it's me. But the other piece of that is like oftentimes I think people talk about grinding through and the resilience, but I actually think the thing that was happening there, more importantly for me at least, was just sort of the like intense focus. And so like the mess or whatever is because I don't care about anything else. I was like very excited and like oriented around the conviction I had in this particular business that we were building out. And also like if you're so intensely focused on it, you can get the signals when it's not working out. And so like paying attention to that is important. I feel like a lot of times people talk about like an idea they have, but then they're distracted by so many other things. And so I do think like one of the key things is that you like, if you're really convinced that this is what you want to work on, that it becomes like everything that you're thinking through until you realize that, you know, maybe you should switch directions or find something else that is equally like resonating with you.
Wow, yeah, thanks for sharing that. That was both incredibly moving and also hilarious at the same time. Cool, yeah. I guess final question on this note. You mentioned Subbable, which was the competitor product launched by another huge YouTuber, launching just like a month or two after you did. But you actually ended up acquiring Subbable and becoming the sort of clear category winner here, in spite of other competitors as well. And I'm curious, do you think that was just because you were able to move faster? Or were there any other sort of big strategic moves that you made that helped you win?
I think it was in this particular case, and not always, but in this particular case, is because we were out there first. And so we had already had adoption in a product that just had higher switching costs. And so it ended up that Subbable, which we actually thought that, and they even had some innovations. Their product was really slick in our mind. And so they had built out a team and were quite capable. And the product worked for what it needed to do. But they just didn't grow because we had already gotten most of the mind share at that time. And so who knows, longer term, if they kept going on it, I think maybe there was a possibility they could have even grown larger. But Jack and Hank built out a relationship after that. We started hanging out at VidCon, and then it just made sense to sort of like merge the efforts together.
Got it. Jonathan, you had a question?
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of like talking about the demythologizing of that. Another speaker I had recently was talking about just how like what people might share in the beginning that sounds really good might not necessarily be the thing that actually happened, and be mindful of the stories that are told. And I love it seems like there's a kind of strong sense that you had as you shared that kind of like, don't just keep grinding away. And I want to kind of like get that a little bit more, because it seems like a point that you're very passionate about. And I feel like I don't like I kind of intellectually get what you're saying, but I feel like there's more underneath that I'm not fully getting yet.
Sure. Yeah. Let me talk about this a little bit. First, I think there's like the motivation for why all the stories come here, and why like even something like how I built this is oriented around, like resilience. I think it's very relatable. It's very palatable because everyone goes through these experiences of like whether it's failure or just difficulty. So I think it just speaks to a larger audience. And so that's why I think a lot of people gravitate towards talking about that, because it just resonates. And there are a lot of mappings where you hear about things like Pinterest or Reddit taking just many, many, many years. And so I think it's also relatable in the sense that, hey, it's okay. This is a long process. I do think, though, that the reason why it took many, many years and they were able to get through it is because they just got the signal early on that convinced them, like, Ben in particular was working on other ideas too. I think coming up into what became Pinterest, but like, I think within their community gatherings early on, he just saw a lot of engagement and power. And similarly, I would say for Patreon, like we got emails, just long written, so excited, so happy about this. And, I had worked on other products. So an aspect of this might be the fact that we were dealing with consumer. And so it is more delightful. There are certainly types of businesses, I would say, right, on the enterprise. So again, it's not one size fits all, but I say, but even there may be enterprise companies. I think Gusto talked about this not a lot. When they were like Zen Payroll, where they wanted to offer delightful payroll despite how boring I think it was. And I imagine maybe similarly they got really positive feedback. But at least from my perspective, right, I built these other things, and you get emails and you get people talking about it. But then when we launched Patreon, they would just be novels of feedback and people that really cared about what didn't work out. And you could just see that there was a need here, whether we were going to capture it or not. And so I think it's also like, do you hit upon, I think startups are a lot of things, but one of them is sometimes it's just mapping to a consumer trend or psychology that's going to happen one way or another. Like some startup will capture it, but if it's not this one, it's another one. And so like when you fall upon that sort of emerging market or like the zeitgeist of what's going on, I think you can feel it again through like the feedback, the signals, the emails. And maybe that's what I'm calling out, because when you don't, it might be a timing thing. So you could keep grinding and going ahead and seeing what happens. But I think there are a lot of companies. The other thing I was doing in college, like I tried many different ideas. I was doing like food delivery. I was delivering like In-N-Out burgers to campus through like a website. You could argue, well, if I just kept working on that, then like that becomes DoorDash. But I don't think in any world, there are many companies doing that sort of delivery stuff. Many companies are doing really well. You have Seamless and Grubhub doing phenomenally well now, multi-billion-dollar categories, but still, DoorDash and your Postmates coming up in that mobile era, just that timing ended up where they could focus on that particular market segment. And that's what worked out for them. Yeah, they're larger in market cap. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's super helpful. Like what I'm getting from what you're saying is like I imagine there's something like, oh, if I just kept grinding away on some of the previous projects, sure, there's like revenue and profit, but there's something distinctly different that when you were working on Patreon, it's like it's like a whole flood that like you don't have to keep like I don't need to keep forcing myself if I'm doing something to just keep going. Like there's something that might happen, and maybe especially with consumer, that kind of is like the magic thing that you don't have to force it, and things are just a lot more enjoyable. Is that kind of what I'm getting from you?
Yeah, it you can just feel it through the emails. And actually, now that I'm thinking about this, even on enterprise, so AdWorld was a mobile advertising company. We served ads. But even in that case, I remember like there was a flashbulb moment when we made it our API public. So what we did was we allowed these app publishers to, at that time, you had to pick one particular advertising network, whether it was AdMob or MobClicks, or I think there are all these other ones too at the time at Quattro Wireless. And because of how the pushes worked on the App Store, it wasn't like a website. You couldn't just update, use a different provider, or sort of change out different ads on the fly. You'd have to submit a new App Store update with the new SDK. So we built out this SDK that had all the different advertising networks, and you could switch between them. You could optimize if one ad was making more money than another. And we got, I mean, this is so boring, right? This is enterprise stuff for optimization, but it had to do with money. And we got such amazing feedback. And when something failed, people got so angry. And it's just that different like degree of care. I think that even when I was making money with like Chomp On and some of these other businesses or getting adoption, a lot of people just didn't seem to really care in the same way, at least I would say, based on the feedback that we got in both those cases. I think AdWorld was something we sold too soon. It was like early. So that's the other thing that you can work on too. Like that was probably a mistake in the other direction. Maybe should have been a business I did keep working on, just looking at how that industry sort of developed, even though it wasn't that exciting.
Thank you. You might have just saved me years of my life doing something that doesn't become a thing. Appreciate it.
Cool. Well, speaking of sort of consumer versus B2B, it feels like, today there's a lot of talk about how creators are the new SMBs. And it seems like in the creator economy, there are some startups that are trying to be sort of new content platforms or marketplaces, and some startups that are more just like pure SaaS solutions for creators, and maybe some that are somewhere in between. But Patreon, as I understand it, has evolved a bit in terms of, like you described its founding days as more consumery. It seems like at some point you tried to become even sort of a platform where people would go to discover for creators and content. But more recently, it seems like you've shifted more toward being more like a SaaS platform that serves the needs of creators who are essentially independent businesses. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about sort of the different opportunities in the more creator like content platform side versus creator SaaS tool within the creator economy, and how you sort of think about that at Patreon.
Yeah, and maybe a good place to start, I had this loaded up before, is just, yeah, this guy here. I'm going to screen share again. So I think COVID is really interesting in terms of what's happened. And it's like really clear just in, I'm just realizing now we're recording this. But anyway, yeah, it's fine. So it's confidential, just everyone and everyone else that sees this in the future.
Yeah, we can edit it and take out whenever you want. So
Sure.
please don't hold back.
Yeah. But what we're noticing is there's certainly something that happened, and that's like really clearly reflected in this is the amount of money, right, that every set of creator cohorts makes over time. And so through really the beginning of time with Patreon, we saw this increasing. And so, there's certainly some trends, but there are moments where we've seen in the past. One time was like when YouTube, it was called like Adpocalypse. They started banning a lot of channels from monetizing because their advertisers were upset at the content over it. And similarly with COVID, we're just seeing such a huge acceleration into people moving their businesses online. because their previous revenue streams didn't exist. If they're doing like live concerts or just anything that required a physical presence, they had to find a different revenue stream to substitute for it. And it's happening like on every single cohort as they're launching. So I think it's also shifting like the whole mentality. Like we always saw some growth at the beginning, but I think again, it's just the degree of it. We're seeing something rise a lot faster. So I think relative to like, you see this now too. I think like at the beginning, and what I mean by you see this too is there are a lot of startups now, and I think a lot of discussion, even for the incumbents. Like you have Zuckerberg going on earnings call and talking about how important creators are in this whole space. So it used to be the case that like early on with Patreon, we had to talk about how Alex Day, who probably now a lot of people still hadn't heard of, but like Alex Day launched his album. He was a YouTuber that did music too, on the same day that Justin Timberlake launched his new album, whatever it was, like the 2020 Experience or something. And actually, Alex debuted higher on the iTunes chart than Justin Timberlake. And so like we had to use examples like these to show that these influencers and creators were actually gathering a lot of engagement and traction, even if you hadn't heard of them, because they had such, I guess, like strongly motivated communities. And then we had to, also talk even deeper into the company's history about examples like how Game of Thrones, generated 20 some, I think, million views on like the series finale. But you have channels like 5 Minute Crafts that generate like 100 million on like a weekly basis. And I think this is now understood. And so these stories don't need to happen anymore. I think now you have all kinds of businesses figuring out whether it's creators want to like sell goods, or they want to sell a token of themselves, or they want to figure out how they can build like auctionable sort of, well, NFTs being a big thing right now, that allow them to earn perpetuity forever. So people are like figuring out all these different business models. I lost the core of your question, so we can also jump back in and happy to talk through it.
No worries. I mean, the original question was more around sort of being a content platform versus a B2B solution for creators.
Got it. Yeah. So I think content is critical for us just because our origins are all around like YouTube. And now we're seeing a lot of traction also in like the podcasting space. So fundamentally, the way that we view why content is important is because at least for a membership business, it's the two-sided marketplace. So you have to offer value. Initially, I think Patreon offered a lot of value to the community patron side because people wanted to support these artists. There was certainly a sense that like what the artists were doing were contributing good into the world. And so you wanted to be a part of that. And it was very like donation oriented. But I do think like longer term, the broader market is very much around, my colleague Lee Jin talks about this a lot with like, people ultimately have to land on like ROI for themselves on the consumer side. So you see, I think a lot of education companies, you see like Masterclass capitalizing on this. I would even say like companies like Cameo are very much about pandering to like how awesome it is on the consumer side to get something from a celebrity or to send it off to one of your friends for a birthday thing, so it feels very personalized. I think there are dangers in some of this around authenticity, which are also a very important thing with like the whole creator economy. But I guess the core of it is that ultimately content has to be the way that you deliver, in our opinion right now at least, on ROI to your users.
Got it. That makes sense. And yeah, I'd love to go back to you showed a graph earlier about growth in COVID trends. I mean, obviously the creator economy has blown up during the pandemic. Patreon's experienced crazy growth as a result. Yeah, what was that like sort of in, I guess, March, April 2021? Like, did that change the way that you thought about the business? Were you worried, or have you been worried that it'll slow down now that things are reopening?
Yeah, well, we were worried at the beginning for sure. I mean, I think a very logical conclusion is that paying this sort of money is very like discretionary spending to creators, and so that might be the first thing that goes away when you're worried about survival or there's a worldwide pandemic going on. So we didn't know. We were certainly concerned, but it was pretty quickly that we saw it sort of flip the other direction, and like our numbers started growing a lot faster, and we saw a lot more adoption. I'll say like the narrative now on this is ultimately like sort of the way I see it is like there was an acceleration in people that previously were maybe offline oriented for their business or not fully familiar with how people were making money online. That's become a much more of a norm. And I think on top of that, there's a lot of really interesting discussions now about even existing platforms like Instagram and Facebook. So here, I got another thing. We ran through this pretty awesome sort of it's this group called Founder, which is a group of designers. I think they're out in like London that used to work with Steve Jobs, and we went through a whole like thinking session about like what's going on in this space. And they put together this deck, and a lot of the points here resonated, which is there's a lot of like juxtapositions of what's going on. On one hand, you have like things like TikTok and all these tools that make it so easy to create now. It democratizes the process, as they call it out. It makes it so that everyone has access to tooling that allows them to put out content into the world. And at the same time, that's terrible. And you see that on platforms like Instagram, Facebook. There's a lot of material now talking about this. I'm sure plenty of folks have seen even like the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma or whatever. But the point more on that is there, because of all this content, and I think the way that they described it is like there's so much content and people consuming that the rules around what's happening with this content is adapting to the fact that like you're just trying to appeal to the masses. And so there were articles recently about how the internet was largely built on a one size fits all model, where like the algorithm will determine, because it's not particularly biased or emotional perhaps, and so it's the best objective way to determine what one should see. And even in some ways, you could argue with TikTok, it's very algorithmic based. But like you have Instagram now removing the like counts because they understand that that's part of what the system that they built on the platform. And I think effectively this one size fits all mentality is going to go away as these creators become more powerful. And so you see at the top of the market today already, large creators like David Dobrik, who got canceled and is trying to come back now. Or I guess Mr. Beast is a better example. They're building out their own platforms and businesses. Like David did Dispo, right? The photo sharing app. And then you have Mr. Beast building out, well, businesses too, like Mr. Beast Burger. He built out his own app that got like millions of users trying to like play a game to win money. And so I think more and more of these creators are going to want to own their brand in like very tangible ways across their own platforms. And so the way platforms are either going to have to adapt, are they're going to have to allow for this customization, or they're going to have to allow for not like I guess again the one size fits all model for various creators, or you're going to see effectively, and I think this is where a lot of other bets are going, this sort of decentralization of like creators on these platforms, which they're already upset about because they don't necessarily own their communities on Facebook, on Instagram. They don't have their email addresses. If they send out a post, they're not guaranteed to reach all of them. So I think there's already a large need here. And I think that's why there are a lot of people making bets in that space too.
That's really interesting. Yeah, but speaking of the internet being one size fits all, I guess my understanding for Patreon is that it's kind of a one size fits all solution for creators who want to monetize. And of course, there are a lot of creator monetization startups that are sort of finding niches of creators and helping those monetize. So yeah, at Patreon, like, how do you think about that?
Yeah.
How do you, yeah.
I mean, so I think that great. Got me at that. I like it. It's because we do membership and subscription, but I think the way we think about that is like the gatekeeping to a community that you can trust, and beyond that, there are many different ways, and we don't care particularly. We just want to stay focused right now on this idea of membership. We don't care how creators monetize. We tried to build out a merch solution. We certainly know that creators like to sell goods. I think again, what's happening with like NFTs and auctions is a really interesting space. But we just view the subscription as like one means for sustainable revenue, but what people are delivering can really be anything. And that's why we built out like a whole tier structure around this. And we see a lot of different customizations, whether it's creators doing like teaching sessions that are live, or they're producing a lot of like, podcast series that are exclusive to themselves. So I ultimately, I do agree. There are a lot of different types of products now that are effectively figuring out, various monetization mechanisms for creators. But ultimately, I think, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to build out a framework that gives you access to the people willing to pay for you. So like the idea that you will ultimately have a CRM of your users, I think is much more scalable than necessarily like the only way you'll get paid is through subscription basis.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think then that, in this space of sort of creator monetization and helping creators directly own their fan relationships, do you think that there will be sort of one winner that monopolizes it? Or do you think there is actually room for some of the smaller players who are trying to play in this space to actually grow to be maybe not like as big as Patreon, but like still unicorns?
Yeah, this is we think a lot about this particular question actually. And our sense is that it actually is going to splinter, or it already is. So you have, first of all, the fact that creators are not across a single medium format. And so you have, and not only that, they end up being multi-channel. And so you have Spotify, for example, right, where you have now podcasting and musicians. But you also see a lot of them may have a YouTube presence. And on top of that, now you have to build out your Instagram and your TikTok presence because audiences are gravitating there. And so creators are sort of existing across all these different channels and mediums and even formats. I think people would argue, and so already that's splintered. I think the idea of how you monetize will ultimately end up across a bunch of different categories too. I think Shopify is really interesting in terms of what they're allowing, starting out with businesses, but now ending up as effectively storefronts and moving down into like building out a membership too for creators, right? And having their own property. So I because of that, because there's so many different areas that creators exist in and are growing out their audiences in, I think ultimately they'll be monetizing across a bunch of these channels. Again, I think where we're trying to exist is that we can build maybe a CRM system that allows you to think about feeling folks who are willing to pay for you. And then you can continue building a relationship with them. It may be that they ultimately end up paying you through other different channels. But the one thing we do believe in is that creators will end up being multi-channel, whether it's where they get paid or not, from an audience perspective for a really long time to come.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm curious if you've thought about, if creators are not necessarily monetizing on Patreon, but Patreon is more like a CRM for them. Have you thought about, for example, monetizing by charging creators, or I guess by monetizing by helping creators sell NFTs, or other ways for just like other people to invest in creators and share in that upside?
Yeah, not as much. I mean, our intent isn't to necessarily build out new ways to charge creators today. I do think like there may be a new set of services around. We would build out like Patreon Capital, which offers loans because we have a lot of visibility on what their data looks like to creators that could be useful from a tooling perspective. I mentioned the NFT part too. I think this whole space, I told you early on, I think like emerging markets are really interesting, but with stuff like NFTs right now, I still feel like it's really early. And what I mean by that in particular is it's not even clear what the standard for this stuff should be. I know there was whether it's controversy or concern around a lot of these early NFTs that were sold. The actual data, whether it's an image or audio or video, isn't even actually embedded within the purchase itself, right? Like it was usually a link to another platform, which made it ultimately dependent on that, like 20 years from now having to exist. Otherwise, I don't know what you ended up buying. And so I think there's a startup called like Pinata trying to solve that. The other piece for creators that's I think concerning with decentralization NFTs is just from a payment category perspective, or from payments perspective from consumers, it's just still very difficult to figure out how they're going to pay. There's a company that I'm invested in called Strike, which is trying to solve some of the issues around that. But effectively, I think what's happening today still with just crypto NFTs decentralization, it's all speculative from the perspective of people trying to make money. And that is not, I think, the type of economy that ultimately it has to be. Now that may be the thing that gets us going there, which is awesome. But you look at things around like the Rally coin or I forget the other one that BitClout, that's what it is. Yeah. That even took off in some ways at a wider scale. That is like a very weirdly closed ecosystem where people are trying to make money. So you buy like the utility coin and then you try to buy all these other creator coins. And I think people are just speculating because it's not even necessarily the creators that own them, that the value of this will go up. And that is, I think, permeated too much of the market right now where we don't effectively want to potentially endanger creators where they figure out, oh, I'm worth this much. And then they start making plans and doing things. And then, it's so speculative that it crashes. Our thing that we've noticed is, again, creators value, or at least what we want to focus on right now, consistent and reliable revenue for their business.
That makes total sense. Yeah. And I think it's cool that you're thinking about sort of what's best for the creators. I want to open it up to audience questions since we have a few minutes left. Noah?
Thanks for giving this talk. It's been fantastic. I'm curious, what are some things from your early developing years you think had major influences on what you're doing now? I think the piano anecdote was fascinating. Maybe a certain work ethic or being okay with being isolated would be two random guesses, but broadly speaking, I'm curious what made you.
Sure, yeah. Oh, I got all these things that are fun. The one I was showing before I had done from an ETL talk. This is actually a photo of me when I had stuck my finger into a door hinge as a child, and then my mom slammed it, so like the top of my middle finger popped off. Actually, like even now, like your middle finger should be your longest finger, but on this hand, it's not, because they couldn't ever sew it back together. But I use that, right? Going back to even the mythology of resilience, I use that as like, despite this is like why I wanted to do piano. And then when I ended up in Carnegie Hall, it was like in high school, it was because of all that determination and grit. But I actually think, just to your direct question of like what really made me tick, it was a lot of like working in isolation and just like having to focus and think through a problem without being able to rely on anyone else, because then you really have to flesh out all the edge cases and really like question, is this going to work, versus just hoping. And I even see that now, actually, to be honest, in like organizations and even ours. The best people are those that think of like the area that of the business that they're leading as the owners, right? And that they don't really have anyone else to rely on. And when they do, then you end up with like less quality work. And so I think that's a big piece. There's actually another odd piece that maybe is unique to Jack and I that we talk about a lot, which I actually think for us, we have like chips on our shoulders from experiences that we've had prior to this. So like Jack talks sometimes about this anecdote where he's working on his bands. He went straight to YouTube after he graduated and did music. and he, Pomplamoose did phenomenally well, and they had millions of views and were a huge viral group, him and his now wife. And he was at an event or a party, like explaining to someone about, how he's a musician and working on this stuff. And then he just remembers that person putting, like, the stranger putting their hand on his shoulder and going like, good luck. And just this sense of like, should I feel shame? Like, why is this person so solemn about this? I'm so excited and we're crushing it as an artist, but just because they haven't heard of our band, that's a perception. And similarly for me, I remember at Looped, actually, I love Sam Altman. He actually was really helpful in a lot of my career. But I was in this meeting with a manager, and maybe this is helpful too, as you guys are building out your businesses. Managers are so important. And he had promised me so that I could like end up focusing on analytics, which was an area that I really cared about for a while, even though I had started off in engineering. And so he had kept putting me off for 6 months. And so finally in this one meeting, I was like, hey, we've been talking about this for a while. I really want to focus on this. And you've already promised, and it's been like well past the time that we talked about. And he went to me and he was like, hey, how many companies have you built? Like, you got to trust that, like, you got to let the people figure out these decisions. And then that was the day I went to Sam and I was like, I have to leave here. I can't do this anymore. And so I think Jack and I fuel off of this like lack of belief in us and trying to work hard enough to show that we can get through things. I don't know if that's necessarily healthy, but it's something that you just asked about, like part of my identity. I think that's a piece of it.
Appreciate it. In The Last Dance, Michael Jordan does the same thing. So you're in good company.
Okay. Sure.
Between Chris and William, I actually don't know who might raise their hand first.
William was first.
Thanks, Chris. Hey, Sam, thanks so much for that talk, and Amy, I appreciate you putting it together. Sam, I just recently started at Quora, the question and answering platform. We've had some monetization features, but we're thinking about like moving more fully into the creator economy with some more monetization features and everything. And I think the question I have for you is, like, there must have been some people using your platform, using Patreon to monetize, and you kind of rather they wouldn't. And so, like, how did those conversations kind of happen for y'all?
Sure. The first one that pops right to my mind is good old 8chan. That was the first one that monetized off us, and we had so many discussions internally because at that time we didn't really have our community guidelines fleshed out. We wanted to be, I made this very engineering tech, I'll try to make this quick, I know we're approaching time, mentality around, hey, people should have freedom of speech and they should be able to do whatever they want. And we've been around like over 8 years now. So I think a lot of the thinking here has certainly evolved, right? Even through like the Trump era and what speech can actually do when in various forms. 8chan was the situation where it's like, hey, we're funding a platform that isn't itself posting this like egregious and oftentimes illegal content. But they just don't have the means or capacity to necessarily filter it out. And we can't determine the intent of them, whether they like are actively trying to keep this stuff on or not. And ultimately, what it came down to was a combination of things. One, I would say two stuck out in particular. One is the brand of what we wanted Patreon to represent externally. And this is why, despite no moral qualms, we don't allow pornography. We just know that sort of stuff will take over and become the brand of the platform. We certainly believe like art shouldn't have a bunch of gatekeepers around nudity and what is art. But we did have to draw a line regardless of that around pornography. So I think brand is a big one. And then the second piece was just around the health and the safety of the community. And so what was happening on 8chan, and I think there's a lot more material now and thinking around this, which is helpful, is people are getting doxxed. So their public addresses were getting exposed. People were getting death threats and bullying, which are actually illegal. And it was permeating. There were things like Gamergate into Patreon. And so because of that, we first and foremost cared about, for the audience we were serving with these creators and artists, that they didn't feel unsafe, that they didn't feel we were supporting creators or people that were engaging in unsafe behavior. So I think those are the two big things that we focused around.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Well, I know we're at time. Do you have maybe 2 minutes to answer Chris's question, or?
Yeah, I do it. Yeah, we can run through it.
Yeah. Hi, Sam. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's amazing how Patreon has empowered creators to like build their own communities around their own SMBs. Before you had brand name creators on the platform, how are creators empowered to build communities amongst themselves within other creators on Patreon?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is largely how we grew, right? It's because like Jack, we had a whole bunch of press when we launched because those were my connections in the network. I think we launched on like Wall Street Journal with All Things D. We saw a spike in traffic. We saw no adoption. No one paid any money from that. Jack went on YouTube. He posted the video, asking for money, and then all the fans came in, and then from there, creators who followed him and saw Jack continue then reaching towards us and launching their own campaigns. So in terms of how you're saying, like, it's not all mainstream creators, like creators are connected to each other through these existing networks. And we see that today. And so I think the key for us through all this growth that I know a lot of other startups are focusing on too, is how do you get creators to publicly be talking about what's working out for them? Because even if they're not mainstream, like everyone knows them, what matters is that they have degrees of connection into them that are really strong. And oftentimes, actually, it could be a really powerful creator. I'll give another example. Jeff Wittick of David Dobrik's crew recently launched with us because he had that need. And now, we get to talk to a lot of other people that are from that network. And so continuously, I think that's what we're seeing. These networks of creators already exist. And just by talking about Patreon, that's how we're going through it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Sam. This was a great conversation. I learned a lot. Really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Yep. Really enjoyed it. All right.
And thanks everyone for coming.
See everyone.
Thank you.